Okay, so you want to own a nuclear power plant. Buy a reactor, feed it a small amount of uranium, and sell electricity every hour of the year. Fuel is cheap. Demand never disappears. Competitors cannot simply build another plant next door, and the government may even pay you to keep it open. It sounds like the ultimate protected money machine. That is the dream. The problem is that you are not buying a machine that produces electricity. You are taking responsibility for a regulated industrial city whose debt security force maintenance program, waste inventory, and political obligations survive even when the turbine stops. A nuclear plant can run for decades and generate billions of dollars of electricity. It can also lose money while operating safely, consume cash while producing nothing, or spend years under construction before anyone knows whether the original budget was real. The same asset can look priceless to a data center company, uneconomic to a merchant generator, and unavoidable to a regulated utility. From the outside, the business is simple. Heat water, spin a turbine, send power to the grid. What sits underneath is much stranger. A nuclear power plant is a long-duration contract between engineering regulation, capital markets, electricity customers, and time. Uranium creates the heat, but financing determines whether the plant survives. Operators control the reactor, yet regulators control whether it may run. The turbine earns the revenue, while reliability decides how much of that revenue actually appears. At the end of the plant's life, the owner still has decades of work ahead. Start with a physical machine. Inside the reactor, uranium fuel releases heat through fission. That heat produces steam. The steam turns a turbine, and the turbine drives a generator. The physics is impressive, but from an owner's perspective, the important feature is not the reaction itself. It is the cost structure. Nuclear fuel contains enormous amounts of energy, so fuel expense is relatively low compared with a fossil fuel plant. Once the facility exists, the owner wants it operating almost continuously. In 2025, the U.S. nuclear fleet averaged a capacity factor of about 91%, meaning the reactors produce close to their maximum possible output for most of the year. By March 2026, the Energy Information Administration counted 96 operating commercial reactors at 57 U.S. plants, with an average age of roughly 44 years. That age is not automatically a weakness. A reactor that has already absorbed its original construction cost can be extraordinarily valuable. The concrete transmission connection, cooling systems, operating staff licenses, and local political relationships already exist. Replacing that package is difficult. Keeping it alive, however, requires constant spending. Before you earn $1, you need permission. In the United States, commercial reactors are licensed and monitored by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The original operating term is generally 40 years, followed by possible 20-year renewals. A later renewal can extend operation toward 80 years, but the owner must demonstrate that aging systems can still perform their safety functions. That means inspections, engineering analyses, environmental reviews, public participation, documentation, and plant-specific commitments. Buying an existing plant does not let you bypass this system. The operating license, ownership structure, technical specifications, security plans, emergency procedures, operator qualifications, and financial assurances remain attached to the facility. A license transfer needs regulatory approval. State utility commissions may decide what cost can be charged to customers. Grid operators determine interconnection and market rules. Local governments influence water, land use, taxes, and emergency coordination. Fuel vendors, insurers, lenders, labor unions, and major customers can each become gatekeepers of their own. Money is necessary, but it is not sufficient. The buyer must prove technical competence, financial capacity, and the ability to operate a facility where a normal industrial mistake can become a national political event. Even the staff is licensed differently. Reactor operators complete extensive training and examinations before they may control the plant. Security programs must address external threats and insiders. Emergency plans are coordinated with federal, state, and local agencies, and full-scale exercises are conducted regularly. Spent fuel must remain protected in pools or dry casks. None of these obligations disappears because wholesale electricity prices are weak. The regulator also sends a bill. For fiscal year 2025, the NRC annual fee for each operating power reactor was approximately $5.3 million before additional charges for specific licensing reviews and inspections. That fee is not the largest expense in the plant, but it reveals the model. You do not merely comply with regulation, you finance part of the system that regulates. Now consider the entry price. There are two completely different businesses hidden inside the phrase, own a nuclear plant. One is acquiring an existing reactor. The other is building a new one. An existing reactor may change hands for a surprisingly modest headline price, if the seller wants to escape future capital needs market risk or decommissioning obligations. Signing the purchase agreement is only the beginning. A buyer is also evaluating the remaining license life, expected maintenance, refueling schedule, labor agreements, pension obligations, spent fuel arrangements, decommissioning, trust, power contracts, tax treatment, insurance, and the probability that a major component will need replacement. A low purchase price can hide an expensive deal. Building from zero is the opposite. Land reactor containment structure, cooling system, turbines, transmission equipment, safety systems, engineering work, training, licensing, and years of construction require capital long before the first kilowatt-hour is sold. Department of Energy estimates suggest that a first-of-a-kind advanced nuclear project could carry overnight construction costs of roughly $6,000 to $10,000 per kilowatt. For a 1,000 megawatt plant, that implies $6 to $10 billion before financing costs. Oh, overnight cost sounds as though the plant appears instantly. It does not. The phrase excludes one of the most dangerous expenses, the cost of time. Interest accumulates while concrete is poured. Components are redesigned, inspectors review work, and schedules move. Every delayed month requires more labor, more project management, more financing, and another month without electricity revenue. A project with a technically reasonable construction budget can become financially impossible if completion moves several years into the future. Plant Vogtle in Georgia shows how large the financing structure can become, even when the reactors are eventually completed. Units 3 and 4 entered commercial service in July 2023 and April 2024. Public filings show that Georgia Power's net capital forecast for its share was about $10.7 billion, excluding roughly $440 million of capitalized financing in that particular cost table, while total Georgia Power financing costs were reported at approximately $3.53 billion. Oglethorpe Power, a 30% co-owner, reported around $8.3 billion of actual project costs, net of major settlements and reimbursements. Those figures are not the total cost of the entire two-reactor project. They are separate owners describing their own shares. That is the point. In nuclear construction, a fraction of the asset can cost billions. The project also depended on extraordinary financial support. The Department of Energy issued up to $12 billion of loan guarantees to the Vogtle owners. Loan guarantees do not make construction free. They reduce financing risk and help the borrowers access capital on terms that might otherwise be unavailable. Without some combination of regulated cost recovery, government support long-term contracts, or a very strong balance sheet, financing a new large reactor is almost impossible. Once the plant is operating, the revenue stack looks more attractive. The first layer is energy. Each megawatt-hour delivered to the grid earns a market price or a regulated rate. In a traditional utility model, the plant's costs and an allowed return may be recovered from customers under state regulation. In a competitive market, the owner sells power through day-ahead and real-time markets bilateral contracts or hedges. The second layer is capacity. Some regional markets pay a plant for being available in the future, not only for the electricity it produces today. A 1,000 megawatt reactor may therefore receive one payment for energy and another for the promise that the capacity will be ready when demand rises. Ancillary services form a smaller layer. Grid operators pay resources for services that maintain reliability, frequency, voltage reserves, or system restoration. A large nuclear unit is not always the most flexible participant, but plant configuration and regional rules can create additional value. Environmental attributes add another source. Nuclear plants produce electricity without direct carbon emissions during operation. Utilities, states, corporations, and governments may pay for that characteristic through clean energy credits, tax credits, or long-term contracts. The Federal Zero-Emission Nuclear Production Credit illustrates how policy can reshape the owner's economics. The credit applies to qualifying electricity produced and sold after 2023 and before 2033. Its base value is 0.3 cents per kilowatt hour, with a potential 5 times increase when wage requirements are met, creating a maximum near $15 per megawatt hour before the revenue-based reduction. When electricity revenue is stronger, the credit falls. When market revenue weakens, the support can become more valuable. In plain language, the policy creates a partial floor beneath existing nuclear plants. It recognizes that a reactor may be valuable to the grid and climate goals, even when the wholesale market alone does not pay enough to keep it open. Long-term power purchase agreements can be even more important. A buyer agrees to purchase output or its clean attributes for many years, giving the plant owner predictable revenue. In September 2024, Constellation announced a 20-year agreement with Microsoft, supporting the planned restart of the former 3 Mile Island Unit 1, renamed the Crane Clean Energy Center. In 2025, Constellation also announced a 20-year agreement with Meta, tied to the 1,121-megawatt Clinton Clean Energy Center in Illinois. These contracts reveal a major change in customer power. Large technology companies do not merely want electricity. They want large quantities of reliable, around-the-clock, emissions-free electricity located within specific grid regions. An operating nuclear plant can provide something that a new customer cannot quickly reproduce. That scarcity strengthens the owner's position, but the customer still has leverage. A reactor may depend on one long-term buyer, one state support program, one utility commission, or one regional capacity market. If the contract expires, the law changes, or the customer renegotiates, the economics can shift while the physical costs remain. Now, the cost machine begins. According to the Energy Information Administration's 2024 data for major investor-owned utilities, average nuclear operating expenses were about $23.08 per megawatt hour. That included approximately $9.87 for operations, $6.84 for maintenance, and $6.37 for fuel. The number looks attractive compared with the revenue a plant may earn. It is also incomplete. Accounting categories do not eliminate the owner's need for capital projects, corporate overhead, insurance, regulatory work, refueling, outages, cybersecurity, emergency preparedness, pension obligations, site security, major component replacements or financing. A plant may report competitive operating costs while requiring hundreds of millions of dollars for a steam generator, cooling system, transformer, turbine work, or post-Fukushima safety modifications. Refueling is especially revealing. U.S. reactors typically stop every 18 to 24 months to replace part of the fuel and perform maintenance that cannot be done at full power. The outage is planned like a military campaign. Thousands of tasks, contractors, inspections, and component replacements are compressed into a narrow window because every extra day means lost generation. A high-performing operator may complete a refueling outage in a few weeks. A problem discovered after shutdown can extend it far longer. Revenue stops immediately. Many costs do not. Payroll continues, security remains, the control room stays staffed, interest is still due, insurance does not pause, regulatory reporting may increase, contractors remain on site, replacement electricity may have to be purchased if the owner has promised power to customers. This is operating leverage in its most unforgiving form. When the reactor runs at high output and power prices are healthy, a large amount of revenue flows across a mostly fixed cost base. When output falls, the fixed structure turns against the owner. The reactor is cheap to fuel, but expensive to own. Waste adds a second time horizon. Used fuel leaves the reactor core and enters a spent fuel pool. After sufficient cooling, it may be transferred to dry casks. With no permanent U.S. repository operating for commercial spent fuel, many plants continue storing it on site. The owner must maintain security, monitoring, licensing, and physical infrastructure long after the electricity was sold. Decommissioning creates the final obligation. Before operations begin, the licensee must establish a financial mechanism to support eventual cleanup. NRC estimates have placed generic decommissioning costs in a broad range of roughly $280 million to $612 million. But actual site-specific costs can be higher and may exclude long-term spent fuel management or restoration work. Owners report funding status regularly, and the trust fund becomes part of the acquisition analysis. A buyer who focuses only on next year's electricity margin is not buying the whole plant. The asset begins before construction and ends after dismantlement. The central trap is now visible. Revenue depends on output, market prices, contracts, regulation, and policy. Most obligations depend only on the fact that you own a nuclear site. VC Summer in South Carolina shows what happens when that mismatch appears during construction. In 2008, SCANA and the state-owned Santee Cooper announced plans to build 2 AP1000 reactors beside the existing VC Summer unit. The ownership fantasy was compelling. Electricity demand would grow, a standardized reactor design would reduce construction risk, regulated rates would help finance the project, federal production tax credits could reward completion. The project seemed to contain the protections a private developer would want: captive customers, state regulation, a major contractor, a modern design, and government incentives. Then schedule became the enemy. Construction suffered substantial delays and cost overruns. Engineering and project control problems accumulated. Productivity failed to match the plan. Westinghouse, the primary contractor, entered bankruptcy in March 2017. The owners were left with incomplete reactors, uncertain completion costs, and a deadline for federal tax credits that was becoming harder to reach. Continuing required more billions. Stopping meant admitting that money already spent might never produce electricity. On July 31, 2017, SCE&G announced that construction would cease. A later filing showed approximately $4.7 billion of SCE&G project costs had been capitalized by September 2017. Federal prosecutors eventually described the abandoned site as an $11 billion nuclear ghost town, paid for by investors and customers. The failure was not only technical, it became a crisis of information and incentives. Executives were later convicted or pleaded guilty in cases involving misleading statements about the project's schedule and the risk to tax credits. Settlements and transactions produced billions of dollars of ratepayer relief, while the unfinished structures remained. The broader lesson is larger than the misconduct. Regulated projects can appear protected because customers begin paying before completion. Protection may weaken discipline if bad news is delayed, disputed, or hidden. Fixed-price construction contracts can appear to transfer risk until the contractor cannot absorb the losses. Federal tax credits can improve economics while also turning a schedule date into a financial cliff. The decision to continue can look rational one year and disastrous the next, because each new dollar is judged against the hope of rescuing all the old dollars. Vogtle reached the opposite outcome. Its 2 new reactors were completed, entered service, and now produce power. Yet, success required regulated recovery, owner support, contractor, changes federal loan guarantees, settlement payments, and years of persistence. Completion does not prove the original budget was accurate. It proves that the financial and political coalition survived long enough to finish. Operating success has a different shape. Constellation runs the largest nuclear fleet in the United States. Its owned fleet achieved a capacity factor of 94.6% in 2024 and 94.7% in 2025, excluding certain jointly owned plants from that operating metric. A single owner with many reactors can spread engineering specialists, outage planning, fuel procurement, training systems, regulatory knowledge, trading capability, and corporate overhead across a larger production base. Scale also changes bargaining power. One plant negotiating with suppliers is a customer. A fleet is a market. Experienced teams can move from outage to outage. Lessons from one reactor become procedures at another. Fuel purchases, insurance, spare parts, and maintenance contracts can be managed as a portfolio rather than an emergency. Operational excellence is only part of the explanation. Constellation also benefits from existing assets whose original construction is largely behind them. Growing demand for reliable, clean electricity, federal tax support, regional capacity markets, and customers willing to sign long contracts. Underneath the fleet are climate policy, data center growth, constrained transmission, and the scarcity of around-the-clock low-carbon power. That combination explains why a reactor, once closed for economic reasons, may become valuable enough to restart. The machine did not suddenly learn to produce different electricity. Markets learned to value the timing, reliability, location, and carbon profile of that electricity differently. Put yourself in the owner's seat for one illustrative year. Assume you control a 1,000 megawatt existing reactor. At a 92% capacity factor, it produces about 8.06 million megawatt hours in a year. Suppose the combined realized value from energy capacity, clean attributes, and other grid products averages $65 per megawatt hour. Total revenue is approximately $524 million. Using the EIA's 2024 average as a starting point, fuel operations and maintenance at $23.08 per megawatt hour consume about $186 million. Set aside another $100 million for sustaining capital outage work and major inspections. Security, insurance, regulatory expenses, corporate overhead, and decommissioning contributions take $55 million. Financing and the required return on owner capital absorb $120 million. The plant produces roughly $63 million before tax. That is not a bad business. It is also not the effortless river of money imagined at the beginning. More than $500 million entered the system, and close to 90% of it was committed before the owner could celebrate. Now change one variable. A major equipment problem extends an outage, and the annual capacity factor falls from 92% to 70%. Output drops to about 6.13 million megawatt hours. At the same average realized price, revenue declines to roughly $398 million. Fuel expense falls because less electricity is produced, but the staff security force, insurance, regulatory organization, capital program, and debt barely move. Assume fuel declines to $39 million. Fixed operations and maintenance remain near $130 million, and the other obligations still total $275 million. The result is a loss of about $46 million before tax. One extended outage has moved the owner from a $63 million profit to a $46 million loss. The swing is more than $100 million. Even though the reactor remains valuable, the license remains valid, and electricity prices have not changed. That simplified model is not a forecast for any specific plant. Real results vary with contracts, regional markets, ownership structure, depreciation, taxes, capital projects, refueling cycles, and regulation. It demonstrates the mechanism: generation disappears faster than obligations. Price can create the same reversal. A merchant plant may operate perfectly while cheap natural gas, mild weather transmission congestion, or subsidized generation pushes wholesale prices below the level needed to support the facility. That is why some reactors closed for economic reasons, despite strong safety records and high capacity factors. Regulated ownership shifts the risk rather than removing it. Customers may pay approved costs through rates, but the utility commission decides what is prudent. Cost overruns can be disallowed. Political backlash can cap recovery. The owner may earn a stable return during normal years, yet a failed project can transform into lawsuits, settlements, and years of regulatory conflict. The future of nuclear ownership will be shaped by who is willing to absorb these risks. Existing plants are becoming more valuable because they already possess the hardest assets: licensed sites, grid connections, trained workforces, cooling, access, operating histories, and public institutions built around them. License extensions, power uprates, and restarts can add electricity without recreating an entire greenfield project. Palisades in Michigan illustrates the new logic. The plant shut down in 2022 and entered decommissioning, but a restart effort later attracted a federal loan guarantee of up to $1.52 billion. Regulatory steps advanced during 2025, making the project a test of whether a retired commercial reactor can return to service. The value is not simply the reactor vessel. It is the possibility of recovering an 800 megawatt licensed site faster than building an equivalent new plant. Crane follows a related model. A long-term corporate buyer helps support the restart, reducing exposure to uncertain short-term prices. Through the agreement, the customer receives reliable clean energy, the owner gains revenue visibility, and the grid recovers existing capacity. Regulation still determines whether the plan may proceed, but the contract changes the financing conversation. New reactors will need a different breakthrough. The Department of Energy estimates that repeat deployment could reduce advanced nuclear overnight costs by around 40% compared with first-of-a-kind projects. That improvement depends on standard designs, reliable supply chains, experienced construction teams, modularization, and shorter schedules. The phrase repeat deployment matters more than the phrase advanced reactor. A clever design cannot rescue a project that is redesigned during construction, delayed by missing components, or financed as a one-off experiment. Nuclear economics improve when the second plant resembles the first, and the 10th resembles the 9th. Small modular reactors aim to reduce the size of each capital commitment and shift more work into factories. They may fit industrial sites, data centers, remote grids, or retiring fossil plants. Smaller units, however, lose some of the scale advantage of a giant reactor. Manufacturing volume must compensate for lower output per unit. Until factories receive repeat orders, the first customers still carry first-of-a-kind risk. Demand may be arriving at the right moment. Data centers, electrification, manufacturing, and grid reliability concerns are increasing the value of firm power. Corporate buyers are signing longer agreements. Governments want domestic energy security. Carbon-free electricity available at midnight in winter is no longer treated as identical to intermittent electricity available only when weather permits. That does not guarantee a nuclear renaissance. It changes which part of the machine earns money. The future owner may sell more than megawatt hours. The product could include 24-hour clean energy matching capacity, resilience, locations theme for industry, hydrogen, district heat, or a dedicated supply relationship with a massive customer. Each additional product can improve revenue, but it also creates another contract, regulator, engineering interface, and concentration risk. None of this means a nuclear plant is automatically a good or bad investment. Financing terms, regulation, location, operating performance, market design, tax policy, and new filings can change the numbers dramatically. This is an explanation of the machine, not personalized financial, legal, accounting, or investment advice. Return to the original fantasy. You thought you were buying a reactor that turns uranium into electricity. What you were really buying was a multi-decade obligation to keep engineering, regulators, workers, lenders, customers, politicians, and time moving in the same direction. When they align, the plant can deliver enormous quantities of reliable power for generations, and an old reactor can become more valuable with every difficult year required to replace it. When they separate, cheap fuel cannot save you. An unfinished project can become a ghost town. A safe operating plant can close because the market underprices its output. And one extended outage can erase a year's profit, while debt, payroll, security, and waste remain. So you want to own a nuclear power plant. The reactor is the visible asset. The real business is surviving everything that must continue when the reactor does not.